Here's a harsh truth most people will never admit to themselves. The more you explain yourself, the weaker you look. Not morally weaker, not intellectually weaker, psychologically weaker. And that's uncomfortable to hear because you've probably been told your entire life that communication solves everything. That if people misunderstand you, you just need to explain better, clarify more, add context. But Carl Jung saw something most people miss. He saw that constant self-explanation is not clarity, it's anxiety. Think about it. The people who explain themselves the most are rarely the most respected. They're the most exposed. And the people who explain themselves the least are often the ones everyone orbits around. So the question isn't, how do I make people understand me? The real question is far more dangerous to ask. Why do I need to be understood at all? Because the moment you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. At some point in your life, you learn that misunderstanding equals danger. Maybe you grew up having to justify your emotions. Maybe you were punished for being misread. Maybe love came with conditions, so you adapted. You learned to explain yourself quickly, clearly, politely. You learned to soften your edges so people wouldn't leave. But here's the conflict Jung cared deeply about. The self you create to survive is rarely the self you're meant to become. And over-explaining is one of the clearest signs that you're still living in survival mode. This matters because every explanation subtly says something. It says, please don't reject me. Please don't misunderstand me. Please see me the right way. And when you repeat that pattern long enough, your life becomes a negotiation. Your boundaries soften, your presence weakens, your words lose weight. Carl Jung believed that true psychological maturity begins when you stop asking permission to exist, and nothing reveals that shift more clearly than silence. Let's interrupt something right here. Most people don't misunderstand you by accident. They misunderstand you selectively. They hear what confirms their worldview. They ignore what threatens it. So when you explain yourself again and again, you're not clarifying, you're feeding projection. And Jung warned about this. He believed that what people see in you is often not you at all. It's their unresolved inner material. So ask yourself, why am I arguing with someone else's unconscious? Sit with that, because this changes everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people aren't ready for. Explaining yourself is often a trauma response, not because you're weak, but because you adapted early. When love, safety, or approval depended on being understood, your nervous system learned something dangerous. If I explain myself well enough, I will be safe. But adulthood doesn't reward that instinct. In fact, it punishes it. The more you explain, the more others feel entitled to evaluate your reality. And Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed that the ego, the part of you that wants to be seen correctly, is terrified of ambiguity. But the self, your deeper psychological center, does not require explanation. It exists whether it is understood or not. And the moment you realize this, you feel a quiet fear, because silence removes your armor. Here's where it gets interesting. Jung believed that individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires something most people avoid at all costs: being misunderstood, not briefly, not accidentally, but repeatedly. Why? Because misunderstanding forces you to choose. Will I stay aligned with myself, or will I perform for comfort? And every unnecessary explanation pulls you further away from your center. So what actually happens when you stop? When you don't clarify? When you don't defend? When you don't chase perception? The answer isn't what most people expect. Let's slow this down. When you explain yourself, one of three things is usually happening. First, you're seeking validation. You want reassurance that you are still accepted. Second, you're avoiding discomfort. Silence feels dangerous when you've learned that misunderstanding leads to loss. Third, you're trying to control the narrative. You want to manage how you exist in someone else's mind. None of these come from inner authority. Carl Jung believed that authority emerges when the ego stops trying to manage perception. Because here's the truth. You do not have access to how others interpret you. You never did. And the more energy you pour into controlling it, the more fragmented you become. Jung described this fragmentation as living outside the self. You're no longer acting from inner alignment. You're reacting to external mirrors. That's why grounded people speak less. They don't rush to explain. They don't correct every misunderstanding. They don't defend their intentions. Not because they don't care, but because they've learned something rare. People who matter will ask. People who don't will assume. And assumptions are not your responsibility. Here's the wake-up slap most people need to hear. If someone requires constant explanation to respect you, they were never going to respect you. Respect doesn't grow from clarity. It grows from presence, from groundedness, from self-trust. And every time you over-explain, you unconsciously signal uncertainty. You tell the world, I'm not fully standing in this yet. But silence? Silence is a statement, and not everyone can tolerate it. Carl Jung himself was deeply misunderstood by colleagues, by institutions, by society. When he broke from Freud, many saw him as unstable, mystical, dangerous. He could have spent his life explaining himself, clarifying his theories, defending his vision. Instead, he withdrew. He wrote, he observed, he listened inwardly. And in that silence, he developed ideas that reshaped psychology forever. Not because he explained more, but because he trusted himself enough to remain misunderstood. That's not arrogance, that's individuation. Silence feels dangerous because it removes the illusion of control. When you stop explaining, you allow people to project, judge, misinterpret. And that triggers a deep fear. What if they see me wrong and leave? But Jung would ask, what if they see you wrong and stay? What kind of relationship is that? And more importantly, what if explaining yourself is the very thing keeping you surrounded by people who don't truly see you? This is the paradox. Silence doesn't isolate you. It filters. Here's what quietly begins to shift. Your nervous system relaxes. You stop scanning for misunderstanding. You stop rehearsing justifications in your head. Your words become fewer, but heavier. People start leaning in when you speak. Some leave, some get uncomfortable, some push harder, and that's the test. Because those reactions tell you everything. As Jung believed, what resists transformation reveals where transformation is needed, sometimes in others, sometimes in you. Here's the one habit that changes everything. Before you explain yourself, pause, just one breath, and ask silently, am I explaining to connect or to protect? If it's protection, don't speak. Let the discomfort pass through you, because every time you resist unnecessary explanation, you strengthen your inner authority. You teach your psyche, I can exist without permission. And over time, something remarkable happens. People feel it, not consciously, but intuitively. They sense your groundedness, and that presence speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Carl Jung believed that your life does not become meaningful when others understand you. It becomes meaningful when you stop abandoning yourself for understanding. When you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth, and the world adjusts. If this spoke to something you've lived, if it felt uncomfortably accurate, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We explore psychology, identity, and self-mastery here, without noise, without performance, and without chasing approval. And remember, you don't need to be understood to be real. You don't need permission to be whole. Sometimes, silence is the most honest thing you can offer the world.